Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all again. I want to take a little bit of time in this reflection to say something by way of an introduction to a new preaching series, which is starting with the online service, which we'll join together to watch this coming Sunday on the 21st of June. If you're part of our church family, or if you've only just recently started to join us by watching these videos, then you'll know that since the middle of April, we've been thinking each Sunday about different Psalms. And at the time that we started to look at the Psalms, we felt that they were especially helpful texts for a number of reasons. There was an incredible emotional range in those poems, and also a language which is very real and honest. And during this time when many of us have been all at sea, wondering where we're going from one week to the next, all of us adjusting to the lockdown in one way or another, the Psalms felt very appropriate for that season when we were trying to initially process everything that was happening and bring it all before God. But obviously, a lot has happened since Easter. Right at the beginning of the lockdown, you might remember an occasion when it was suggested that we would be through all of this in about 12 weeks. And looking back, my guess is that I'm not the only person who now realizes how naive I was in believing it might be so. We really had no idea, did we, what was coming. And clearly things are different now. We're all aware that this is not going to be something which passes off in the space of a few months and then we all get back to normal. We all realise now it's going to be a long time yet before church services resume, at least with the sizes of congregations that we used to at SBC. And of course, there are also going to be many other adjustments and changes which we face in our lives. We have questions about when schools and universities are going to be reopening at anything like their normal capacity. Lots of us who've been working at home in recent months are going to be wondering if the offices we worked in will ever be the busy hubs that we were used to in the past. We can use public transport, but not if many other people are using it, and we have to wear a mask now to do so. And again, we find ourselves asking if the capacity of the public transport network will ever quite get back to what it was, and what does that mean for our jobs? And sadly as well, there's a great deal of economic uncertainty as the government furlough scheme begins to wind down, and we wonder which jobs are going to survive and which won't. In recent weeks, there's a phrase which many of us have heard on a regular basis. Lots of us talk of the new normal. You heard that phrase? It's one of those terms which seems to become a sort of catch-all way of talking about the fact that we don't really know exactly what life is going to be like in the future, just that it's going to be different. And so this feels like the right moment as a church for us to change emphasis and ask ourselves, how are we going to adjust to life in this new normal? We find ourselves now in this strange place, a place that none of us could have imagined being in a few months ago. If we're honest, not a place many of us would choose to be in. And now that we're here, what are we going to do? How are we going to navigate this new landscape? Right at the beginning of the book of Lamentations, we find these words about another time and place when the people of God find themselves in a new normal. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. There's a scenario that many of us might recognize, a vision of roads that are empty. You can almost picture the boarded up pubs and shops. But actually, it's an event which, dare I say it, is even more shocking than what we're going through. And if we read further on into Lamentations chapter 1, we get more of a feel for just how devastating and great the loss is. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations, she who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. The scene which is being described for us here is an event which we usually hear referred to as the exile, the defeat of the southern kingdom of Judah near the end of the 6th century BC, a time of terrible humiliation and pain for the Jewish people, a defeat which is a painfully long drawn out process. So here's what happened. Initially, what the Babylonians did was to capture and take away the finest and best of the ruling people of Israel, the ones who we could think of as the ruling class. When you think about it, you don't have to take everyone away into captivity to weaken a country. You just take the finest minds, the ones from the most capable and ruling families, and then you set out to do a kind of brainwashing job on them. You take away the Jewish identity, you turn them into good Babylonians, you reprogram them, you teach them a different language, you give them different food to eat. These are the sort of young people we read about in the book of Daniel. And then there comes for Jerusalem a time of final total defeat. The walls of the city are torn down. 2 Kings reports how the temple, the royal palace, all the houses of Jerusalem are destroyed. And when you go back to Lamentations and the description it gives of just the terrible loss that the Jewish people are going through, you read there of how they talk about the roads to Zion mourning. Because instead of being full of pilgrims, those who travel to festivals in Jerusalem, the roads are empty. Nobody needs to go to Jerusalem. Nobody can go to Jerusalem to worship. No temple, no festivals, no gathering together for the people of God, at least not in the way that they remembered it, not in the way that they want it. This is the moment which we could think of as being the ground zero for the people of God in the Old Testament. It is a time of almost total loss. All of the old certainties have given way. And this is a defeat which is so devastating because, of course, Jerusalem is no ordinary city. The site of the city, Mount Zion, is spoken of by the psalmists as the joy of the whole earth, a sort of dwelling place for God, from where God shines forth, according to another of the Psalms. Psalm 125 begins with these words: those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. So it's no exaggeration to say that this loss of Jerusalem feels like a failure of all God's promises. And of course, as I said earlier, another dimension of this is the loss of the temple, the loss of the building, which has been so central to the worshipping life of the Jewish people. Why is it, you might be asking, that we're making this period in the Old Testament the focus of our studies for the next few months? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Even though the situation these exiles faced isn't exactly the same as the one we're in now, we think there are some parallels which can be drawn. Clearly, we don't think of our building on Allington Road in the same way the Jewish people thought of their temple, but we are facing some big questions because of the lockdown. What does the church look like when you can't actually enter the church building? What does worship look like when it's not possible for people to physically gather? I think those were questions the Jewish people had to work through. And then there were other issues they had to reflect on as well. And it's probably fair to say those are issues that have been staring the church in the UK in the face for a long time before we went into this season. How do we remain faithful to God and bear witness to God in a culture which in many ways feels post-Christian, where the dominant values of our society are not aligned to ours? We're not in a different location. I mean, we've not been taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. And yet the landscape, the situation we find ourselves in, can feel more and more alien. But as we look at this period in the history of the Jewish people, it's also important to note that terrible as it was, in spite of the fact that no one would have chosen to find themselves there, the exile did turn out to be a time of renewal for the Jewish people. There was a new discovery of how God can be present, even in a moment of loss. If you look even further ahead to the book of Ezra and the story it tells of the return from exile, you find there is a description there of a people who have repented of the sinfulness that led them into exile, who have a renewed commitment to living faithfully for God. We're going to be thinking about this period by focusing on the books named after two of the prophets who emerged during it, Isaiah and Jeremiah. And as I think about the message from God which they bring to the Jewish people, there are three things which stand out for me. And I would encourage you to look out for these themes as well as we consider what life looks like in the new normal. Firstly, it seems to me that what the prophets are saying to the Jewish people is accept the reality of the situation you find yourself in. One of the stories we'll read in the next few weeks concerns a fascinating contest which takes place between two prophets. One, Hananiah, effectively tries to gloss over the seriousness of the situation. He says to the people of Jerusalem, sit tight, and before too long this will all be over. It's a comforting message. It doesn't ask them to change. And in contrast to what he says, it's a far greater challenge given by Jeremiah, who warns of an exile which will last 70 years. That's a long time, not forever, but it's a long time. Jeremiah warns the people, you can't just put your head in the sand. You need to adjust to what has happened, and you need to live differently in light of the new circumstances you find yourselves in. And I think there's a perspective there which is going to be important for us as well. The fact that we need to accept that this is a time of very profound change in our society and world. And the church needs to understand and face up to that if it's going to be able to faithfully witness to God and the gospel, whatever the post-lockdown landscape is going to look like. Secondly, what we're going to discover is that the prophets encourage God's people to look out for the new thing which is happening. So yes, this is a time of loss, but God works through it. It is so often the way. The times of great disruption and upheaval are often moments when God works in new ways and his followers come to a greater understanding of what he is like. Isaiah very memorably speaks of a new thing springing up and asks the people of God if they perceive it. And I think there's a similar invitation for us in this moment. Are we going to be alive and alert to the new thing God is doing? And then thirdly and finally, the prophets encourage God's people to take responsibility and to serve and to welcome outsiders. So God doesn't allow the people to just feel sorry for themselves and to have a kind of pity party in Babylon. They're told instead to seek the peace and prosperity of Babylon, the place where they end up in exile. We find that advice in Jeremiah. And in Isaiah, we find a picture of how the boundaries of the covenant community are going to be expanded so the foreigners can come in. We also find a description there of true worship, which is all about loosing the chains of injustice, feeding the hungry, and clothing the naked. And I wonder what God might have to say to us in those passages. Maybe that, even though lockdown is hard, and a time that we find immensely tough, it's not a moment to just think about our own survival and our own needs, but we've got to keep on thinking about the needs of others. We've got to look outwards. That's all for now. But I hope and I pray that as you come with us on this journey, you would be encouraged, you would be inspired, you would have your horizons broadened, and that this would be something experienced not just by you personally, but by all of us, Salson Baptist Church as a whole. So hopefully I'll see you again on Sunday when we'll kick off our series by looking at a famous song first sung by the Exiles, Psalm 137. But for now, let me pray for you. Faithful God, you who showed yourself to your people in new and creative ways in the moment of exile, would you please show yourself anew to us, not for our benefit or blessing alone, but so that we can keep looking forward, seeking the peace and prosperity of Selston, worshipping you not just in songs we sing or reflections we watch, but by making room in our lives for acts of service and kindness, by making room in our lives for the outsiders you love and you want to draw to yourself. Amen. I'll see you soon, friends, hopefully on Sunday as we begin this journey through the prophets. Bye for now, and until then, God bless.